I think we should start. It's a very great pleasure to welcome Silvia Kolbowski, who's going to present some of her work this evening. Silvia is an artist who works in New York and is also on the editorial board of the journal, which will be known to you October. Her recent work is kind of conceptual in nature and also in terms of site-specific works. And her recent work in collaboration with Peter Eisman involved an installation at Comme des Garçons and an entry for a Holocaust memorial in Vienna. So I'd very much like to welcome Silvia.
Okay, usually when I present my work, I just kind of launch right into the first slide, but because this is, I would imagine, a largely architectural, or an audience made up of architects or architecture students, I thought that I would preface it a little bit, and then what I'm going to do is present some projects that I've worked on my own since about 1988, and then move into some projects that I've collaborated on with architects such as Smith, Miller, Hawkinson Architects, and Peter Eisenman. I'm not showing you everything that I've done since 1988 because each project involves a certain amount of explanation. You'll see why, because of the kind of work that I do. It's not like showing a picture of each project or of each of a painting or a sculpture. But I've tried to choose some representative projects. I guess I should also say that the title Forms of Critique is, of course, a kind of play on the idea of the critique of form. I inverted those words because I wanted to point to my position as an artist and a maker of form of some kind, as opposed to the position of a critic. And in fact, my work at October magazine is to some extent from the position of the artist as well. So in a sense, I see myself as somebody who critiques through form, even though my work is sometimes formless. And in this case, I'm using the word form to refer both to a thing, an object, a place, a practice, as well as to the methodology by which such are devised. So I'm just going to briefly read something and then go into the slides. I wanted to start with a reference to the work of the art historian Benjamin Buchloh. I don't know if you know his work. He works out of New York now, but he was trained in Germany. One of the major implications of Buchloh's critical writing is that, with reference to painting, that painting was, but no longer is, the site of religious or cultural or emotional or psychical sublimation or displacement. Painting as a site of sublimation has been displaced first by photography, according to Buchloh, and then by film and television as media through which we live. It could be said then that this leaves the art object or practice, whether it's painting or the kind of freestanding sculpture, that it leaves the art object or practice in a rather ineffectual position. In reaction to this situation, in relation to these other media, art seems to either remake itself perpetually in the trappings of former periods, hence the tradition of easel painting, which seems to refuse to die, or art seems to have to continually try to reinvent itself in one form or another. Sometimes it seems to me like a court jester trying on more and more extreme or spectacular costumes. It follows that in the face of this, the architecture of the art museum moves more and more away from, or the art gallery moves more and more away from the concept of a container to become the thing in itself. I'm sure that's something that you're all aware about. Recent examples being the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona by Richard Meyer, which opened to the public empty of art, or the American Center in Paris by Frank Gehry, which is now being sold, never having been seriously inhabited by art or any kind of collection. Many, many other examples exist. And I am somebody who attributes this, in a sense, to the lack of significance that art seems to have today. Thus, I can state in an extremely oversimplified and polemical way that I believe that there are currently two types of artists in practicing in the Western world. One is the artist who, in the guise of making meaningful aesthetic objects, succeeds in pointing to the current meaninglessness of art. And the other is the artist who, in the guise of making art about the current meaninglessness of aesthetic practices, ends up attempting to produce something of cultural meaning or value. And I would say that I'm somebody who belongs to this latter category. Like the work of many of my contemporaries, the critical aspect of my work relies on the notion of intervention rather than opposition. The work is often dematerialized, and in some collaborative projects, as you'll see, as well as in some independent work, the work is extremely dematerialized. It's sometimes not even so visually discernible. In the past few years, I've been drawn to collaborating with architects for, it seems to me, two main reasons. I mean, there are many reasons, but two main reasons. One, because of the appeal of the program as a limit and as a demand in relation to which a project can be situated and meaning generated. And I know that the program as such has not been terribly popular in architecture schools. Perhaps that's fading a bit now. But it appeals, I think, to artists who find the kind of vacuum created around the making of art difficult to deal with. And two, I'm drawn to collaborating with architects because of an affinity that I share with certain architects for utilizing explicitly overdetermined systems to point to the overdetermination and systemization of all cultural productions. In other words, art is supposed to be something generated purely through free expression. We know that this is not the case, and you can say in a way that art always has an implicit program. In architecture, a lot of these things are overt, and the relationship to limits and restrictions are something that I find interesting to play with, especially in the 90s in making art. Okay. What you see on your left is is a kind of wall plaque, which was also the image of which was also on an invitation to an exhibition entitled "Enlarged from the Catalog of the United States of America." This project was produced in 1988, and I should explain that it was part of a longer series, all entitled "Enlarged from the Catalog." And what I did in each project was actually go to an existing exhibition catalog of some kind or other. In this case, it was a catalog for the American Wing holdings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and go to these catalogs which functioned as a kind of closure or endpoint and open them up to some kind of inquiry and produce an exhibition out of a catalog as opposed to producing a catalog out of an exhibition. It also allowed me to deal with certain subjects that, at least in the United States, let's say subjects to do with outside of my own immediate cultural arena, which where sometimes artists were thought to be presumptuous to deal with, to be dealing with, and therefore, because these catalogs were already institutionally produced, I was able to pick up on a lot of different subjects that already, in a sense, existed in the world. So what I should explain to you is that what you're looking at here in red is part of the plan of the American Wing, actually most of the plan of the American Wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In black, this is a plan of the gallery, Postmaster's Gallery in New York, where this exhibition took place. And on the right, this is the view that you would see as you entered the gallery. In fact, it looked as though something was in the way and as though you would not be able to open the door. The black elements here, you'll see, let's see. No. Yeah. Uh-oh. Okay. When you entered, you would see these display cases all located in rather eccentric places. There seemed to be no rationale. In reality, these display cases were located in relation to the plan of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but placed in the gallery, and they were situated in relation to very particular sites at the museum. For example, sites of transition from one exhibition to another, sites of information, sites of different threshold sites of contemplation where there were benches. So that the installation actually, the positioning of objects actually carries the residue of the other plan and the other site, but here located in the kind of typically neutral space, or what appears to be the neutral space of the white gallery. In the display cases were silk-screened images. Each display case had 2 superimposed images that were drawn from the catalog of the collection, spanning the full chronology of the collection, and silk-screened over each other without any particular logic other than chronology, so that in some instances the images were blocked each other out and you were not able to read them. There was another component which was a catalog that I produced for the exhibition, which in a sense was a kind of catalog of the catalog. And if you sat down on the bench to read the catalog, the so-called exhibition disappeared. And what this catalog consisted of was a variety of things. There were excerpts from the Metropolitan Museum of Art catalog, and there were some images drawn from that catalog as well. And in addition to which, there were 3 texts that I reproduced, all having something to do with quotations concerning language, subjectivity, and the law. There was one excerpt from a book about teaching English to Chinese speakers, another, and the kind of irreconcilability of those 2 languages in relation to some issues and so on. I don't want to dwell on these, otherwise we'll never get to the other projects.
Could you say just a word about the splitting of the text on the slide on the...
Right, I'm glad you mentioned that. The catalog was printed on translucent paper, so that it functioned as a kind of palimpsest, so that you could not read one text without reading the one right below it. And so there was always a layering of the kind of official text of the museum and the inserted text that I used, whether they be captions of the 18 objects represented by the silk screens in the display cases, or excerpts from their introduction. In addition to the, one of my excerpts, for example, was a table of contents from a slave narrative, just the table of, which was an extremely long table of contents, which functioned as a kind of narrative. Thank you. Now on the right, let's see, do I have them? No. Okay. On this installation was actually produced with the idea of making it site transferable, site-specific in a transferable way. So the intention was always to be able to place it somewhere else. And I got that opportunity, the opportunity to do so about a year. This was in 1988, the exhibition in I think it was 89. I was asked to contribute something to a group show at the Whitney Museum, the downtown branch near Wall Street, to a show called The Desire of the Museum, which was in a sense a show about the kind of hidden structures of the museum. And what I did in that instance was to, rather than overlay the plan of the Met onto the whole plan of this museum, because it was a group show, it would disperse the display cases in such a way that the project would be unreadable. I ended up situating the plan in relation to this staircase. Now, the space was designed by Todd Williams and Billy Tsien, and basically it was just, in a sense, a kind of undesigned space, but the one area that did have an interesting aspect to it, I don't know, I can't get this, oh, there it is, was this staircase where the perspective was, in a sense, forced on one side, and when you were standing right here looking up, because of this triangular wall and the forced perspective on one side, there was a kind of moment of disorientation. You couldn't tell exactly whether this wall was inclined, this one was, or this one was. So the curators and I extended the line of disorientation. Again, in both instances, in the other one and this one, the scale is forced. And we were able to take advantage of the placement in order to block circulation right at that point where the museum wants circulation to be open, so that people had to kind of filter through the installation to get into the exhibition. And that's just another view. We also placed the catalog at the point of entry, so that it functioned to disorient people in the sense that people expected the catalog to be an explanation of the entire exhibition, which of course it wasn't. Now, well, let's see, the USA show was reviewed in a lot of different art journals, largely positively, but when it was negatively reviewed, there was always one basic complaint, which was that the exhibition was not instantaneously surmisable, that it did not, it was not easily accessible, that that one couldn't, in the words of one critic, get it with any kind of rapidity, and that therefore there was some dissatisfaction connected to this. In addition to the professional reviews that were published, a friend of mine, unbeknownst to me, assigned the exhibition to a class that she had, a kind of criticism class that she had at a community college. These were not very sophisticated students, not very familiar with conceptual art. She then showed me the sort of 30 reviews that they wrote, and I found some interesting parallels between the reviews that had appeared in art journals and newspapers and the reviews that the students wrote. Again, where it was negative, it was always the same kind of complaint. So I decided, because I had all these reviews in hand, that I would do something that artists don't normally do, which is respond to a review. But I decided to do it not in written form, but in the form of an installation. So I produced this exhibition called Review, which took place in 1989. And it's somewhat complicated to explain, but you see to the right, this is the invitation that went out on the left to the gallery's mailing list, which was at Postmaster's Gallery at that point, located in Soho, New York. And the back of the invitation is on the right. And I credit both myself and John Constable, his study for a cumulus cloud from 1822. That's the image that you see on the left, and except that it has these little white rectangles laid over the image. This is a Constable's study. And let's see. Basically what I did was the following. I chose the Constable image for two basic reasons. One was that I wanted to choose an art image from the period of Romanticism because it seemed to me that some of the kind of commonly understood tenets of Romanticism were still very present in the expectations that people had in going to galleries even in the late 80s, that they wanted the kind of instant emotional experience and gratification that Romanticism purportedly provided. But I chose the Constable image for a more complex reason, which is that these studies that Constable did, it seemed to me, were located at a kind of threshold. First of all, they were done in watercolor, but they were situated as somewhat scientific studies. On the back of each study, there is not only the exact location, but also the exact time and date. And on the other hand, while there was a kind of an overlay of a kind of quasi-scientific approach or empirical approach to a somewhat romantic, sublime-looking image, they were painted in watercolor. Clearly, watercolor is not a method that one could really use to capture a second's view or a moment's view of the sky or of clouds, since by the time you get further along in the, you begin to actually work in watercolor, that view has already disappeared. So it seemed in some ways kind of proto-photographic, and in other ways, it seemed to capture that moment, which in a sense romanticism does, but most people commonly are not aware of certain contradictions in the culture moving toward mechanization and modernization, and yet pulling back toward a rather romantic view of landscape. I took the Constable image, chose some reviews that took the form of about 18 pages. On the card, again, forced the scale, overlaid them onto the image, and then in the gallery framed each review so that it was framed according to the colors that it was, in a sense, blocking out in the Constable image. So that when you walked into this show, it's not so evident here from the photographs, but it's quite, from these slides, but it's quite evident from it was quite evident on walking in. There was this kind of scintillating coloration. And in fact, since one of the complaints about my USA show had been that there was too much to read, if you didn't want to read, you could have that sublime Constable experience. And if you did want to read, you could walk closer and and actually read the reviews. And I did provide, the reviews are hung at sitting eye level, and there were stools provided that people could move over to the wall to read, to use in reading the reviews. On the right, on your, no, I guess on my left, your right, you can see there was a board that actually included the press release, the invitations, and a list of credits for the reviews, so that, in a sense, the exhibition provided more than what one would normally be expected to provide, at least on a wall. These are images from an exhibition entitled "Enlarged from the Catalog, Michael Asher," and this is 1990. At this point, I was already feeling somewhat backed into a corner, since I was moving further and further away from object making. I had worked previous to all of this with photography and with kind of gridded images of appropriated photographs from the mass media. But I'd been very dissatisfied with the kind of neutral use of the wall that I was making. So in relating more and more specifically to different kinds of sites and trying to kind of challenge the neutrality of the white cube of the gallery, I'd begun to back myself into a corner where it became impossible to make objects. At that point, it was the height in New York in the late 80s, early 90s, the height of the genre of the group show. Because there was such a kind of implosion of galleries in New York, and I guess in other cities around the world, and the art market was, to some extent, at its peak, these galleries could not function the way galleries had functioned before, with a small so-called stable of artists and each having a kind of one-person show each month. There was too much risk, too much financial risk involved. There weren't enough sort of well-known artists to go around, and so the genre of the group show really flowered because the gallery took less of a risk with this idea. You were showing anywhere from 5 to 20 artists. It was easier to sell work in that way. Unfortunately, the group show as a concept was very difficult for me to. Even though I was in countless group shows, it became more and more apparent to me that it was very difficult for me to function in the group show, because when you work sites, because group shows tend to demand the selection of an object very much in advance of the exhibition, and that's not how artists who work site specifically work. They need material for catalogs ahead of time, and I never had that information at hand. You know, I didn't have a selection of works that a curator or a gallery owner could choose from for a group show. So when I was asked to participate in a group show called New Directions, which in fact was, I think, a pretty terrible group show, I decided that the only interest I had was in participating if I could do a project about group shows. And this, in fact, ended up being, I think, the last group show that I was in. Another bridge that I burned. So what I did was the following. I found a project by the very well-known and quite influential, especially in Europe, conceptual artist Michael Asher, somebody who first started to work in the 60s in the conceptual movement in the States and in Europe. A project that he had done in 1973 for the University of California at Irvine Gallery in Irvine, California, where he was asked to participate in a group show. And what he did was, he supposedly, although I find some of this hard to believe, but he took the dimensions of all the pieces of glass covering the different artworks in this group show at Irvine and averaged them out and I think he came out with a 12-inch square. I mean, the only thing I can't understand is why it's an even square. But anyway, somehow he worked this out. He then exhibited a 12-inch square piece of glass on the wall, attached with nails with nothing behind it, and that was his contribution to that group show. Now you can see, or not see, as the case may be, this is a picture of the piece of glass with a reflection in the photograph. I took that photograph, I had it reproduced and framed like this, so that this reflection is in the photograph, not on the glass. And I installed it in this terrible group show with a lot of different colorful artworks, and I added a few more things. Actually, I added the words on the wall next to the number assigned to my work, because each work in a group show has a number. I added the words catalog available. And then at the desk, where they had all the literature on the exhibition and the kind of resumes of the artists and so on, I included a catalog that I produced, which looks something like this. And what that catalog, I'm trying to run through this kind of quickly, but what that catalog included was different captions referring, one, to the Michael Asher project, two, to, in a sense, the initial information that I gave the gallery for their catalog, which I made up, and I indicate that it was purely invented, and then the discrepancies between what I ended up submitting to the exhibition and what I supplied to them beforehand, so that in a sense this catalog, which is actually, it's not a catalog but a kind of brochure, becomes a register of the mismatch between the type of work that I do and the type of institutionalized genre that had developed. Now, it was a kind of fold-out catalog. It also had a kind of running commentary on different concepts of the relationship between individual and group, in a political sense, in a cultural sense, and some theories as to why the popularity of the group show had occurred at that particular time. When you open the brochure fully, it was the exact same size as the piece of glass that was framed on the wall. Now, one of the problems with this catalog, which I suppose was slightly intentional, was that it was limp. It was not, it didn't function the way a catalog should, and in fact, there was meant to be a kind of ambiguity about whether it was in fact an art object or a catalog, and I was told by some people that they felt, since it was free to pick up, they felt uncomfortable about folding it, which of course you had to do, since it was such an odd shape, because they couldn't figure out whether they were destroying the art object or whether they just had this sort of throwaway brochure in their hands. Well, one of these is supposed to be the other way around, but you could probably, I'll explain that. So by the time that I did the previous exhibition, I really was in a situation where I couldn't kind of work backwards to produce any kind of object, since I had, in a sense, made an object about not producing an object. So I came up with this. I know how I came up with this. One of the ways also that I came up with this project, with this idea, was that when I did the review show, the review show was reviewed. In fact, it was actually reviewed by some of the people in the show. And I forgot to mention that one of the people who reviewed the show, who was in the review show, was actually very angry because she had given it a somewhat negative review, but she was very angry because she thought that I had put her in the cloudy part of the sky. So I always thought that was very interesting, since it was arranged alphabetically, but it sort of brought up, and she wrote a review stating that, and sort of brought out the level of projection involved. Really, I forgot to mention that the review show was partly constructed as a kind of critique of the institution of criticism, you know, and its eclecticism and its lack of self-reflectiveness. But one of the reviewers of the review show mentioned that she thought that it was very apparent that my show was very inexpensive to produce. And at the time that I produced the review show in 1989, there was a lot of extremely expensive artwork being produced by people like, I don't know if you're familiar with Jeff Koons or Ashley Bickerton, but a lot of this work was being produced in an extremely high-crafted manner, but using certain mass production techniques, so that the actual materials used and the craft techniques used, it would end up looking like a mass-produced object, but it would cost tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to actually produce, and involved, in fact, quite a lot of craft technique. So I decided I sort of had this rather perverse notion that I would produce the most expensive show in the world for the least amount of money. And that this show would also refer in some way to a lot of that work being produced that my work was often being compared to. So basically, the exhibition was called "An Example of Recent Work May Be Seen in the Windows of Harry Winston, Inc." from approximately 4:47 p.m. to 5:04 p.m., Monday through Saturday, November 19th to December 15, 1990. That's the whole title. And it gave an address, 718 Fifth Avenue. When you turned the card around, it said there will be no reception. And this is because the card was sent out by my gallery in New York, Postmaster's Gallery, to their mailing list. And one, we wanted to make sure that that people would not show up at an opening, but also it, I guess, was a play on the idea that, well, you'll see why when I show you that there would be no reception at the actual exhibition as well. This is 718 Fifth Avenue. It's the headquarters and main building of the world-renowned, maybe I think most expensive jeweler in the world, Harry Winston. There is a revolving display in the windows which changes every day. You cannot enter Harry Winston unless you have an appointment. So it is a kind of exclusive gallery in a sense. I should also mention that the invitation was based on the size of a quarter-page ad in Our Forum magazine, which we also took out to announce the exhibition. To some extent, the only object connected with this exhibition is the invitation and the ad. So Harry Winston, Inc. is, situated in main kind of tourist area of Midtown Manhattan on 56th Street. It's a very popular site, in part because the jewels displayed are so incredibly elaborate and outrageously expensive, and in part because it's across the street from the Trump Tower. Everybody stands here in order to take pictures of the Trump Tower. but this is the kind of, these are the kinds of objects displayed. So to some extent, I wanted to make a connection between the kinds of so-called recent work being produced in New York and some European cities at the time, and to refer to the craft technique and the kind of highly crafted technique employed by the in making the objects. Also to make reference to certain aspects of jewels in relation to the female body and the kind of situatedness of value here. Now, I allotted a certain time, if you came for that sort of 17-minute time frame, you would have a comfortable amount of time in which to look at the jewels, like maybe 10 minutes or 12 minutes, at which point the store would start its closing procedure, which would involve locking the gates, removing the jewels from the windows, and replacing the jewels with a backlit photograph. And this is something that takes place every afternoon. Now, anyway, we could talk about some of this later if people have questions. Okay. So having moved away from any kind of materialized art object in any direct sense, I was faced with the problem of, again, providing something for, in this case, a very different kind of group show. It was a show put together composed of 3 artists who would exhibit singly but consecutively in relation to some of the same themes. And I think we were asked to, this is the gallery on the left in Paris, Gallery Roger Payas, and we were asked to relate to the window, I think it was the window in the gallery. So for my installation, I did the following. I decided that one kind of object that I could produce was something that functioned in a sense as the documentation of the lack of an object. And so I produced a poster. Maybe we can refocus that on the left. Is it possible to focus? Yeah. No? It is a focused slide, but anyway. Okay. This project was entitled Once More with Feeling. It was devised as a kind of continuing project, of which this was one. And basically, it was devised as a concept that could be used to address any white gallery space. The poster consisted of a photograph of the empty gallery, of the particular gallery within which the poster was going to be shown, always with text which was relevant to some kind of extended notion of sight relevant to this gallery. So in this case, in Paris, I used some of the themes that were very prevalent in the news at the time in France, having to do with xenophobia and the emergence of the right, or the growth of the right, and their rhetoric about sending immigrants home and preventing the influx of immigrants, of post-colonial immigrants in general. And in this instance, because I was invited to be in a group show composed, which was typically the case, primarily of men, I used the French language in order to play on some aspects of the French language and some pronouns and lack of pronouns that made reference to some of these conditions, so that the posters always reiterate the kind of data connected with the exhibition. And in this case, it says, in addition to that, 3 artists. They show in the same exhibition, il, the plural, which in this case becomes masculine because there are men and women, not just women involved. And then it says one artist, she only shows when she shows alone. Again, the French language would not register the feminine in the pronoun unless it was only in reference to one woman or a group of women. The minute the group is mixed, it becomes a masculine pronoun. The rest in translation reads, since the woman is a stranger to her own language, perhaps she should be sent home. And then there are two comments that refer to the other two exhibitors in the exhibition to do with screens and different aspects of how they work. The posters were laid on the floor in the full print run, and a tube corresponding to each poster was also exhibited. So hypothetically, they were available for sale from the floor at the same price that you would pay for a poster in a museum store, for example. Hypothetically, if all the posters sold in the first week, the exhibition would be empty. I mean, the show would disappear. This did not happen. And then across the room, and it didn't happen for interesting reasons, but across the room, there was a railing placed around the same image of the empty gallery, in this case, a gold silk screen with no type. So this is the kind of rare art object. Now, I did, again, in the continuing series, which again, hypothetically could continue indefinitely, could take place in any gallery in any city around the world. And this is in part, this project was devised in part to address the kind of universality, at least in the Western world, of this sort of ubiquitous white neutral exhibition space, and to try to find a way to make these spaces specific, which I was finding increasingly more and more difficult to do. So for an exhibition that took place in New York, again at the gallery I show at, Postmaster's Gallery, different color but same poster size, and in this case I also blocked off part of the gallery so that the image on my left, your right, is the image that you saw when you entered, which was the back of a wall, because I was playing against the kind of unspoken demand articulated by the generic large Soho gallery space, which I didn't feel particularly interested in utilizing. So I blocked off part of the space, utilized the space that I wanted. Again, similar kind of approach to the posters and tubes, packing tubes. In this instance, all the text related to concepts of the norm or the normal in relation to either the marketing of art, the pricing of art. There was a lot of talk, because this is when the market had dropped, the art market had dropped. There was a lot of talk in magazines and in the press about the inflation of prices. These are normal prices, these are not normal prices. I mean, we all know that this is a kind of concocted fantasy. What is an appropriate price for a painting or an artwork? And also it referred to the Democratic Convention, which was taking place in New York at the time. And New York was made to appear normal and appeal for the period of time of the convention. For some odd reason, a Democratic mayor cleaned it up, put more police out in the street. It was a kind of different city for a week. That was supposed to appear normal. And then, of course, after the convention left, we went back to sort of dirty city, crime-ridden, and whatever. This, again, this is the image used behind the railing. This is a project that I did. I think this was not my first, but one of the first collaborative projects that I did with architects. I was asked by, Smith, Miller, and Hawkinson were asked by Storefront for Art and Architecture, which is a little exhibition space here that exhibits, I guess, different kinds of thematic shows about architecture, and sometimes one office shows in Lower Manhattan. Smith, Miller, and Hawkinson architects were asked to display their recent work, and they asked me to help them devise a way of installing the work that, again, would not assume a neutrality of space. So what I did was the following. Storefront for Art and Architecture is a very, very strange kind of attenuated, very attenuated triangular plan, it is in fact the leftover space in relation to a building on the corner of a street, a street in Lower Manhattan. And it's a space that could only ever have been used by a so-called alternative exhibition site, because any normal, any more kind of conventional institutional site would never have used such an attenuated site. So what I did was, in a sense, to force a more conventional configuration onto the less conventional one, and wherever these negative, in a sense, negative sites occurred, they became positive, and they became inclined planes of plywood that in this case here you actually had to walk up onto in order to view the exhibition. They were then asked by, no, that's another view on your left. They were then asked by the Princeton School of Architecture to bring the exhibition to Princeton. And what we decided to do was to literalize that, to bring the installation at Storefront over to Princeton. Now, the space that we were given at Princeton was, as in most academic sites, retroactively programmed for exhibition, right? It had been a kind of lobby or corridor space, so there were stairs, there was an entry. It was a very difficult site in which to actually comfortably display something. So what we did was we took the plan of Storefront and basically chopped it up and distributed it around the Princeton site, so that some of it was actually displaced outside. And we reproduced everything referring to the storefront in materials which were not specific to the storefront, which were neither specific to Storefront nor Princeton. And their different projects were exhibited on these structures. Then just briefly, this is, I guess, my first collaboration with Peter Eisenman, with Eisenman Architects, which was just a straight competition for a cultural center in Tours, France. And what we did was to, the site that we were given was, well, basically, I think that we were encouraged to develop this site and to leave this court open as a court. But we work with the concept of striation, which Peter, I guess, has been working with for a while. And what we did was, I guess what was particularly important to me, because this is something we worked with later, we used the computer, a computer morphing program. If you know anything about morphing, what it consists of is the transformation through computerized technique, where, in a sense, if you morph two things one to the other, and you situate something in the middle of that morphing process between these two things, you get something which has the characteristics of both. It's really the transformation of one thing to another. But if you're morphing, I think in Terminator 2, for example, the man morphs into machine. That's, in a sense, morphing from one thing to another. But if you're morphing two things to each other, you end up with a third condition. And so we morphed this building to this building, both the roof line and the facades, and ended up with this structure and lost. But in fact, I think it was, I don't know, proved to be very controversial there. Anyway. I think I'm going to skip this project because I'm kind of running out of time, and I wanted to get to a few other projects. This is a project I worked on with Smith, Miller, and Hawkinson Architects called Homelet, and it was for an exhibition at the Wexner Center called House Rules, and we were asked to produce a project about the suburban house, and we ended up kind of analyzing an extremely banal suburban house and using a variety of strategies of displacement and repetition and relocation, and producing this model, which is, and playing, in a sense, inverting a lot of the conventions of the suburban house in order to produce a project which was not necessarily inhabitable, but was a kind of model of a critique of the suburban house. All the other images I've shown you were images produced from a video that we produced, which documented the whole process. And then in the end, what we did was everybody was asked to produce a model to place on the, everybody in the exhibition was asked to produce a model to place on the pedestal that they provided, and we did not exhibit the model. We only exhibited the videotape of the process and some drawings. Wait a second. It was a group show, and everybody produced a model of their project based on the suburban house. Whoops. Okay, this is a project that I did in London in the fall. It was commissioned to be a part of a large kind of symposium / exhibition series called Desiring Practices, and I decided that since I'd had trouble on another project with budget, that I was going to produce a project that involved no money at all, since Desiring Practices did not have a budget to speak of. And what I decided to do was to use existing sites around London, commercial storefront sites, and to displace objects from one storefront to the other in a kind of a loop, so that without transforming those objects and without transforming the sites, literally, I would produce a new kind of meaning in the reading of each storefront through the displacement. So what you're looking at is, this is a store called MASH, and this is a kind of outdoor display case that they have that they use for displaying propaganda or advertisings for mainly music clubs. And that's a kind of rotating, in a sense you could call it a rotating exhibition that changes every day. And what I did was I took those club listings and I put them in a estate agent shop in Peckham. In other words, I displaced their real estate listings with the club listings. And there was always this was a project entitled, "These goods are available at blank." And the blank was always filled in so that it made this little label made reference to MASH and gave the address where you might find more of these club listings. I took the real estate listings from the Peckham estate agents and put them in a rather upscale custom hat shop on Brompton Road. Now, this shop was surrounded by two other estate agents selling much more expensive real estate properties. And in fact, it turned out that the owner of this shop was the owner of this estate agents. He had a nervous breakdown when he saw this and made us first remove the listings, and then, I don't know if I have a picture. Yeah, then we negotiated with him. He ended up allowing us to turn them around so that they could face inward. But he was mortified by the comparison of prices between the properties from Peckham and from this area. The hats, I don't know if any of you saw this exhibition, this project, but the hats then went to the RIBA bookshop. And so you can see here it says these goods are available at Gabriella Lagenza, Brompton Road. The hats then, and I think if you know what kind of an institution the RIBA is, and the fact that these hats were surrounded both here and across the hall, the entry hall, with the engraved names of gold medalists, I think of, hundreds, and maybe two, I think, were women who worked with men. The hats then displaced architecture books, which went to this very exclusive French patisserie actually across from the hat shop. And there were specific books that were chosen: Architecture for the Poor, Imperial Splendor, Vitruvius, I forget some other books as well. This was the Timeless Way of Building, and this is in the refrigerator that holds the truffles. Then a variety of pastries from that patisserie went to the gallery that I exhibit at in Paris, Galerie Roger Payas, and they were displayed in the window like this. Again, the sign referred the viewer back to the patisserie in London. And I tend to think that this whole project for me was fueled by the idea of getting pastries into this gallery. So that was a success. No, wait, I'm sorry. Then the poster project that I had done for this gallery went back to MASH to complete the circle, and was exhibited there with their club listings. Okay, then this is another project that I did last summer with Peter Eisenman, where we were asked by the Architectural League and a couple of other organizations in New York who put together a series called The Architectures of Display. They chose 5 teams of artists, architects to place installations in commercial spaces of one kind or another in Soho in New York. There was a theater lobby, there was a furniture store, there was actually a kind of popular bake shop cafe, and we were assigned Comme des Garçons clothing boutique, which is, if any of you know this, very, very upscale, very minimally designed Japanese clothing boutique. And what Peter and I did was the following. We analyzed the site in the following way. We said, what is specific to fashion is continual and perpetual change. What is specific to Soho, and this is a typical kind of view of Soho, is stasis, because Soho in New York is a landmark site. You cannot change facades. They recently reinstated cobblestone streets and antique lampposts. There is a stake that the city has in creating this kind of bell jar neighborhood. And so we saw the glass of the window of the shop front as a kind of membrane between absolute stasis and perpetual, actually rather insane change, because in fashion you have to, a designer has to put a new collection out something like 2 or 3 times a year. So what we did was we took 2 clothing designs from 2 different seasons of Comme des Garçons. This project is called Like the Difference Between Autumn Winter 94-95 and Spring Summer 95. We took the drawings of clothing from 2 different seasons, the ones that are included in the title. We again used a morphing program. We laid them or suspended them one over the other and morphed between them to come up with this shape. I mean, there were a variety of shapes, I suppose, that we could have come up with, and this is a wireframe drawing that the computer produces. It's not a kind of absolute form of representing this shape. It is one form. And the idea was to insert a kind of wall into the store, into the boutique, where this element would be cut in half so that to create a kind of corridor space, and then sheathed, not the color, not made purple, but just white, so that it would function as a kind of distorted white wall through which you could walk in the space, and it would become something in between a wall and an art object. This is a boutique that looks like a gallery, so it would become something between a wall and an art object that was composed of the kind of maniacal necessity to create change in this particular business. In the end, we were not able to sheathe, this is a model, and the view of the installed project in the boutique, or I always say gallery because it looks like a gallery. In the end, we were not able to sheathe the framework because of a lack of funds. And we kind of actually decided that maybe it was all right. It was, in a sense, a compromise. In another sense, it functioned differently than we originally thought, but not in a terrible way, so as to produce almost a kind of computer drawing writ large. Where you could almost, I don't know if you can tell here, but you could tell in person that while this thing looked crafted, it was actually somehow related to the computer. I don't have a slide here, which I should. This was actually produced on a computerized, it was produced by a company that did theater sets because we couldn't get anybody else to produce it, and it was actually cut on a huge table saw that was directed by a computer disk, because there was no way of translating this otherwise, in a sense. Now, what we also had was a video monitor playing continuously, and what it was showing was the superimposition of 2 runway shows from the 2 different seasons. The music was superimposed, and the runway shows were superimposed. The visual images of the runway shows were superimposed, so that you always got this kind of amalgam of the 2. We also produced a poster based on their typical kind of way of advertising their seasons, which had this typical view of Soho and the titles. The title. These are some shots of the video which played continuously. You had to walk through this thing to enter the store. And they kept trying to move things around, in fact, but the point was that you could not enter the store without walking through this. Okay. Now I'm running late, but I'll just quickly go through this. This is the project that I worked on just very recently with Peter Eisenman on the memorial a Holocaust memorial for Vienna. It was an invited competition for, oddly enough, about 8 or 10 artists and only 2 architects. And Peter then invited me to work with him, so I was not officially invited. And what we did was the following. The site is the Judenplatz in Vienna, which right now is a kind of parking lot, but they wanted to create an impactful and lasting monument to the Holocaust in a country which has been just where the relation to the period of the Third Reich and the annexation of Austria and the, I think, murdering in Austria of about 60,000 Jews has been completely repressed. I think it's only 2 years ago that there was an official apology made to the Jewish communities around the world. And what we did was the following. We decided not to play it in any kind of sentimental way, and instead to address the specific history of this country, not just in terms of the Holocaust or the Third Reich in general, but in terms of Austria. And what we did was the following. We took a somewhat extruded or elongated map, the contour map of the, this is the Anschluss map, which is the map of the annexation of Germany, Austria, and the different territories that Germany had annexed in 1939. We morphed that map to the contours of the plans of 2 Jewish ghettos in Vienna. So this is the kind of computer process of morphing. And we arrived at this kind of contoured form, this sort of distorted plate structure. And this is basically the size of the site of the Judenplatz. I'll show you, I have more images later. We then took and what you see here underneath, spread across the whole site, is the plan of Auschwitz with the barracks and the official stations and so on. We then took the train lines used in this area, in this geographic area, to take Jews to death sites of all different kinds and morph them to the street plans of these two ghettos. And what that produced, the morphing of the train lines and the street plans of the two ghettos produced a kind of plate structure which we wanted to utilize for the, well, again, you'll see here, for, in a sense, a ground plane on which to walk on inside of this plate structure. So this is the square. And actually, this is a square where they recently found remnants, buried remnants of, I think, one of the, maybe the oldest synagogue in Austria. So we broke practically every rule of this competition. I think we were asked to produce something for one corner of the site. We wanted to span the whole site. We wanted to make it a monument that you could not ignore, because in fact the tradition of monuments in Germany and in Austria to date have been the approval of projects that virtually disappear. And this is a case where, you know, for someone who makes work that disappears all the time, that we wanted something that would be extremely visible and that could be, again, not sort of anti-pedestal sculpture and could be experienced as a space in and of itself, physically, and would work against the typical notion of the monument. In fact, there is a monument that exists here of Lessing, which we were required to keep. So this was actually a street through which they wanted some circulation, for tour buses and cars. But this is a 3-meter high wall, and the structure is split in the center, and in this instance, the morphing of the train lines and the street plan actually distorts the Auschwitz plan. And in this case, it distorts a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Some aspect of the grid structure of the Auschwitz plan, but two different aspects. One is a kind of the negative, and one is the positive. This is some terrible slides taken of the model before it went to the jury. And it proved to be extremely, I don't know, vexing to the jurists, and it just created enormous controversy, and we did not win. The project was awarded to an artist. I don't know exactly what she did, actually. And that's it. About morphing. Well, okay, that's actually a good question. To some extent, the reason that morphing is appealing is because it allows one to not start from a tabula rasa, so that one isn't creating an original object from nothing, or an original space or form from nothing, but from what already exists. So the idea of creating an object in a vacuum is already beside the point then. It is also a way of creating something new, especially architecturally. It's a way of creating something new that also makes reference but transforms what already exists. So in terms of any kind of contextualism or site specificity, it allows one to never replicate, but always transform what already exists, and to have some, again, residue of that traditional form exist. I mean, that's a very interesting observation. I'm not sure that I agree with you, although the first thing that I have to point out is that the last project, the one that I worked on with Peter, because I was invited by Peter, I kind of, it was slightly different than being asked by an institution for the two of us. I mean, Peter never made this demand, but I somehow felt that there was a kind of implicit hierarchy in a sense, you know, that this was his project and I was collaborating. And even though my involvement was at least 50% of the involvement, I think I took his lead in that project, I have to say. But in part I did that, and this is where I think I would disagree with you, or maybe I misunderstand you. In part, I did that because I agreed with him in this particular instance that while we were not observing the typical conditions of monumentality in terms of the kind of discrete object either on a pedestal, or a lot of the projects, Holocaust projects that have been done in the past few years have been inverted. They're in the ground, you look into them, so they kind of invert the idea of monumentality in a sense, but they don't change it in any way. I mean, that project, I suppose, is typically monumental in scale, but in terms of the way that it works the site, that it kind of spreads itself across the site, and it's not a coincidence that they asked for the monument to only occupy one small part of the site. I mean, you know, these were the rules that we broke in a way in order to make a kind of inhabitable monument. And it's not the first one that's, you know, of that ilk, but isn't, I mean, how would you say that it was typically monumental? That it didn't address the institution of the monument?
Well, perhaps even talking about the monument.
What do you mean by that?
I'm not quite sure.
Uh-huh.
But I somehow, I mean, in a sense, I'm being very critical of your early work and stimulating. But then it was very exciting because it was the American Gallery and Museum.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the composition form of the monument is a very beautiful form in the sense that it is in Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
And I think perhaps
Mm-hmm. 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 Well, I mean, I guess one thing I could say is that when I work with architects, I do, there is a kind of insistence on the creation of some kind of form. And this is not, you know, tomorrow will work on something that may not have that, you know, if I work on my own. Because I think that there's a major distinction between art and architecture. They have different histories and different institutions and different conditions, and they're understood in different ways. And what's interesting about the piece that we did for Comme des Garçons was that the other four groups did completely dematerialized work. All the other projects had to do with computers largely, and either architecture on computers or projection of this or that. And we were the only ones that built a form. And in some ways, of course, that appears to be somewhat retardataire these days, you know, or retrograde. But and in terms of art, I would say, I mean, as you can see, that form making could be regarded as somewhat retardataire or retrograde. But in terms of making architecture, I still think this is a time when you need to make form and not necessarily project something on a screen and call it architecture. You know, it may be different in several decades down the line, although I doubt it. But so there is a strong distinction between the work I do with architects and the work I do on my own.
Questions? There's a question over there.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's a very expensive environment of production of work, which is a male production of Jeff Koons and someone else you mentioned, both of them men,
Mhm.
producing very expensive work, and you producing work for nothing at all, and
Mhm.
and and I see those things also in with the Comme des Garçons, the frame, the structure that you produced, and that being something that you don't know whether you want to go inside it or whether you want to look at the outside.
I think I don't know if all of you heard that, but basically the question was for me to say something about the kind of inscription of femininity in different aspects of different projects, and which were very, loosely elaborated. But and it isn't something that I brought up overtly in this discussion. I would say that virtually every project I do does address certain ideas or cultural ideas about femininity. It does not do so in a kind of necessarily in an overt or explicit sense, and it doesn't. I don't necessarily require that the work be identified as feminist per se, because even though I do believe that my methodology, I don't think the methodology in and of itself is feminist, but I do try to, in a lot of the different projects, address femininity, whether it's to do with, certain relations of power or certain inscriptions of the possession of the object or the acquiring of the adornment of the the giving of adornment and so on. I don't know. I think I would just say that there is an aspect of that in all of the work. It is more often than not explicit. Sometimes in the textual material it is explicit, but it doesn't necessarily follow in the tradition of feminist work per se, which sees itself as being produced in a sense from a kind of coherent and homogeneous feminist position. Because what I try to do in each instance, in a sense, is to locate the woman in this kind of convergence of a number of different cultural factors. So.
I want to ask you about time, the role of time in your work, especially regarding the role of space and the expectation that I feel from you to the viewer to spend a certain time, like reading, sitting, going through a certain route, perhaps going all around London and Paris to find out about this display. I mean, what is the role that you would give?
Well, that's interesting because I think, my work for years has been, in some ways, one of the most avid audiences have been architects. And I used to think, well, for a long time, I haven't shown you other projects, but also I thought, well, the work is not particularly architectural in that it's not spatial. But it does deal with time, and it does deal with trajectory, and it does deal with circulation. And to some extent, that was self-consciously instituted as a kind of resistance to the more typical late 20th century way of looking at art, which is extremely episodic and very, very, with very, very brief attention span. So there is definitely an emphasis on not only resisting that kind of condensation of experience, but also, kind of consumption of image, but also to include the body in a more active sense in a site, so that there is a kind of dispersal of the object. The dematerialization takes place in a variety of different ways, and one of the ways that it takes place is through dispersal. I didn't show some of the other projects, but there are other projects where there are things all around different institutional kind of sites in a gallery or a museum that you have to, and one indirectly will lead you to another. So it isn't there isn't a kind of overt guidance, but there is in a sense, an absence that each site creates that moves you to the next, and there isn't necessarily a completion, but there is a desire that's generated to go to another site. And maybe now we have to go to another site. Mark looks like he wants to go to another site.
Okay,
Okay, thank you.